Welcome everyone on this cold Melbourne evening. My name is Nikki Anderson and it's lovely to be here at the Wheeler Centre. Now, the man here with me on stage is fresh from Sydney Writers Festival, so it's really lovely to have you here in Melbourne. Tash Aw, I think, needs very little introduction. We all know why we're here, so I think I'm just going to launch straight on in. I'll tell you first up, though, that we'll have a bit of conversation. Tash might do a reading, we'll see how we go, and then we'll throw to questions. So do store them up if anything comes to mind. And of course there'll be books for sale and book signing after the event. So we're going to be chatting about Tash's third novel, Star Billionaire, which I imagine some of you may well have read. Now, it charts the lives of 5 immigrants in Shanghai. But I would like to ask you first about your own experiences in Shanghai and why you ended up in China for a few brief periods, and also what sort of perhaps displacement or dislocation you experienced.
That's a lot of questions rolled into one, Nikki.
Yeah, I know. I have a lot of double-barreled questions,
okay,
so sorry about that.
No, well, I'll sort of pick those apart slowly. I guess the reason I first started going to Shanghai and China in general was that every time I went back to Malaysia to spend time with my family, I noticed that all the people I had grown up with, a lot of the people I saw living in Kuala Lumpur, which is where I'm from, were starting to move away, as Malaysians have always done. But whereas 10 or 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people would have naturally gravitated towards Western cities, so Western Europe or Australia or America. Now the choice wasn't so clear. In fact, what was really striking was that more and more people seemed to be going to China. And they were going because they were all lured by this incredible sort of illusion that they were going to be able to start totally from scratch. So one example was my mum has gone to the same tiny kind of hair salon in this very ordinary neighborhood for years and years and years, and one of the shampoo girls just suddenly announced that she had been offered a job in China, which just seemed to be so too good to be true. I mean, she was going to be the manager of an international hair salon chain thing, and the moment we heard it, we just thought, well, that's so obviously going to be a disaster. But there were just so many stories like that. But then I noticed it was a different kind of person. It was people that I was at school with, people who are now bankers and lawyers, and they were going to Shanghai. And then by the time I got there to see for myself what was happening, I met Malaysians who are yoga teachers and florists and lifestyle coaches. Yeah. So it seemed as if everyone from so many different kinds of backgrounds were going to China to try and make something for themselves. And so I was really fascinated by this, and I decided to find ways to spend more time in Shanghai. So I applied for a couple of residencies and got those residencies and used those as a starting point for a longer period in Shanghai. Yeah,
with the intention to write or just to experience?
At the beginning, it was just to experience what was going on. I like cities. I find city life very fascinating. I mean, I've lived for most of the last 20 years in London. That's where I've been based, and I grew up largely in KL. And so I'm attracted to what cities represent to people, particularly to people who've come from overseas, and how cities allow people to sort of reinvent themselves. And I think the bigger the city, the bigger the scope is for reinvention. And so all 5 characters who go in the novel, who go to Shanghai, are sort of reinventing themselves in a way. And Shanghai, is a huge city. I hadn't quite realised just how big it was until I went there. I mean, I always think, London's big, and that's a city of 8 to 10 million people, where Shanghai is double. Yeah. And that means that everything is amplified. So the potential, or the feeling that you can do anything is magnified. But then the flip side is that the loneliness is also magnified.
You feel that with the characters as well. They're so alone.
I mean, I think you asked earlier about how much of my own impressions made their way into the book, and I think quite a lot. And I think the loneliness is one of the big things that found its way into the novel.
Yeah. So did you feel very dislocated in Shanghai, or were you just kind of bamboozled by the bright lights and the excitement?
Both. I think that's, to me, that's the whole conundrum of New China. It is dazzling. I mean, certainly in a city like Shanghai or Beijing, as you know, because there's such a concentration of people and energy, you feed off that energy. Walking down the street in Shanghai, one definitely feels much more energetic than, say, walking down the street in Singapore. You have that feeling that there are so many people around you and that everyone is doing exciting things. But that can be quite confusing. It seems as if there's all this frenetic energy going on around you, but you're not quite sure what that energy is for.
Yeah, or how to use it for good.
Yeah, and ultimately I think that everyone is so concerned with achieving what they want to achieve that they sort of wrap themselves up in a little universe, and it's very hard to reach out across to someone and form a real bond. And so for all the characters in the novel, the great challenge is how to establish intimacy. So they've all gone there, they've all left behind a sort of a past, a home, a background that is very limiting, and gone to Shanghai to achieve these great dreams. But what they find is that the one thing that they really want, which is intimacy, still eludes them.
Yeah.
And it's really ironic, because it's as if the more they pursue those ambitions, the less possible it becomes for them to achieve that intimacy.
Yeah, and more sort of unravelled perhaps their intentions become as well, because they do seem to be bamboozled by everything that the city holds.
No, absolutely.
And just going back to what you were saying about Malaysians travelling or people going to China, and there's a very different, well, for a lot of people, there's this different impetus. It's not necessarily about economic migration or, making, obviously a lot of the characters do want to make their fortune, but in your personal experience, it's the bankers and searching a whole new life. And so you've got these different levels, haven't you, of what migration means.
Absolutely. I mean, migration, I think, means different things to different people, depending on what kind of background you come from. So the five people in the novel come from vastly different backgrounds. Three of them really come from quite impoverished backgrounds. They've grown up in Kelantan, which is the northeasternmost state, which is where my father's side of the family comes from. So it's a region I know very well, and it feels very cut off from the rest of Malaysia, and it feels even today very traditional and very rural. And two of them really sort of by accident are able to liberate themselves from that background and those circumstances, and find themselves in through a curious twist of fate in China, where they are struggling to recreate a life for themselves. So for them, China represents a chance to gain not just money but self-respect, and also the respect of others around them, which they always wanted but could never access, because traditional Asian society in a lot of countries like Malaysia is still quite harsh. I mean, people are judged by how much money they have, and these people come from backgrounds where they don't have a lot of money. Whereas for two of the characters who come from much more affluent backgrounds, who are upper middle class and university educated, China represents something different. It represents something a lot more complex, and for them, it's not just about the pure economics. I think it's something much deeper, and I think in a funny way, it's much more difficult for them to figure out why they're in China. Yeah,
and especially as things begin to unravel a bit, it's a bit more existential, isn't it, rather than just kind of trying to go forward. And I think also for those, it doesn't sort of matter with the characters whether they're rich or poor, or like only eating instant noodles, or able to go to Shanghai's fanciest cafes and bars and restaurants. they're still doing it tough. They're still outsiders.
Oh yeah, I mean, some of them are more outsiders than others. I mean, I think some of them. So Phoebe, for example, who's basically a factory girl, she's had to work in a number of really menial jobs, and decides she moves to Shanghai and decides that. The best way to become successful is to pass herself off as a mainland Chinese, one of these glamorous young mainland Chinese girls whom she sees walking the streets of Shanghai, and
massive handbags, big sunglasses,
handbags, big sunglasses. The kind of the cliche of New China, which one sees a lot on the streets of Shanghai and Beijing, and decides that. That's the best way to go around reinventing herself. And because she lives in this enormous city where there is a huge degree of anonymity, she's able to do that. She's able to reinvent herself. And she studies self-help books religiously and tries to improve every aspect of herself, the way she dresses, the way she eats at the table, the way she sort of carries herself when she enters the room, all that sort of thing. And she is really kind of... the one at the end of the novel who I think, I don't know what you felt when you read the novel, but I think that she's one of the ones who's the best place to know, to realize what China has done to her and how she has responded to China.
Yeah, maybe all the self-help manuals kind of helped give her a bit more insight, because she does a good line in kind of pepping herself up and telling herself off,
absolutely,
and analysis. I mean, in a way, she's...
No, but I think that's right, and I think that's part of my the way I want to sort of comment on the optimism that I saw going on in China. So, I mean, a lot of people who read the book said that they were really pessimistic. They found it a really pessimistic book because at the end of the novel, none of the characters has achieved what they set out to. But I find that...
But there were notes of real hope towards the end as well. Like, I found it not so much pessimistic, but heartbreaking at times. I mean, Phoebe especially, I think, just the... she's so optimistic and so wants the best, and she's got gumption, but then she becomes so ruthless, and, she's...
Yeah, she has to turn into something, because Shanghai is a ruthless place. It's a big, like a lot of big cities, it's really ruthless. It treats everyone equally. It doesn't, it's fortunes are made and lost in a day.
Absolutely.
But what I saw when I was living in Shanghai was that there is obviously so much wrong with China, with mainland China, but there is also a lot of optimism, and there is this feeling that I felt by observing people on the metro and just on the street, which was that there was a feeling that they could change their lives and they could make their lives better, and that's a feeling that I don't get. I don't see when I'm in. I don't feel when I'm in London or any of the countries in Western Europe. There's no more feeling that life is on an upward curve. Whereas in China, you definitely get that feeling, and the feeling is that. I mean, I found it quite touching, this thought that you could improve your life, every aspect of your life, by reading a book.
Yeah.
I mean, and everyone was reading self-help books. Yeah. And quite... What was really also very striking was the fact that a lot of these self-help books were translated from American titles. And Americans and Chinese always see each other as sort of as polar opposites of each other. But in fact, I found so many similarities, and that was one of the similarities, the fact that they were, that they're both very optimistic people. I mean, one of the titles that I kept seeing quite early on in my stay at all the counterfeit bookstores was Why Men Marry Bitches. Right. I mean, it took me some time to figure out the translation of that title. But then I realised that was, that's one of the, at the time was a big selling title in America. And it was just so striking because, I come from an overseas Chinese background, which, as you probably know, is quite conservative. And it was just, A, shock, and B, kind of a breath of fresh air to see that kind of...
And also that people of all generations are kind of, I don't know if willing is the right word, but are sort of going along with things, and not necessarily in a helpless way, but we have to look to the future. And
embracing it with gusto, but because I think I think a lot of people in China haven't had these opportunities, haven't had the opportunity to live freely until very recently. So now that things are much more liberal, and they have generally the right to educate themselves as they want, to travel as they want, to read more or less what they want. They're embracing all of that with real gusto. But nonetheless, it is surprising if you haven't really lived in China to see all that happening. And I certainly didn't. I didn't know that the transformations taking place in China were quite as swift. And when my parents came to visit me a couple of times when I was living in Shanghai, once they came at the end of summer, it was very, very hot and in Shanghai. And I think my mother was quite taken aback, because I don't think she'd seen quite so much bare flesh in being exposed, because traditionally Chinese women are meant to be dressed in a really demure way, and Phoebe, when she first arrives, she starts going out on dates, and she dresses in a really prim and proper way, and realizes that she walks into this bar and every other girl is dressed to kill, and that's when she sort of decides that she has to take drastic measures and change her
to
look
get her millionaire. Yes.
But nonetheless, I think that there is if you just take her as an example, by the end of the novel, materially, she might or might not have, probably hasn't achieved what she wants to achieve, but I think reaches a sort of realization about what her life involves and what her life means and who she is, which I think is ultimately a really positive thing.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that it's interesting how I think all of the characters get to that point as they've been sort of hurtling forward, because they've, through the events that have happened, mostly because of the city chucking kind of really, hard balls at them, but also perhaps bad decisions, whatever else, they've had to look backwards as well. There's this kind of interesting thing that maybe, it's one step forward, two steps back, but they kind of, I think most of them end up in a place of perhaps self-reflection because they've had to deal with, I guess, some of the things they've been running from.
No, absolutely. I think that is another thing that I felt really, from what I saw in Shanghai, and also from what I've experienced personally over the last 20 years living abroad, is that for a lot of immigrants, the new country where you are trying to establish a life in, ultimately, emotionally, although that's where you really want to establish a new life, you can't quite escape your past, and your past has a kind of annoying habit of sort of coming back and haunting you, and you can never quite escape it. And a lot of the characters are trying to escape something. They're trying to flee something that they thought they could flee just by physically leaving the country, and they have to go through a lot of ups and downs before they realize that they haven't really dealt with those things properly. And I think China has a way of making you weirdly confront that, because it's very easy to see all these new blinding new transformations as a distraction. So this endless promise of money makes you think, well, it's as long as I make money, I didn't have to think about the rest of the stuff going on, about the politics, about the emotional detachment, or the disconnection that I'm feeling internally. But ultimately, you do have to, and I think that because the material transformations in China are so extreme, ultimately they do make you. You spend endless days on your own. I mean, in Shanghai, there are a lot of people who are desperately seeking a partner, and that's I think it's become quite a rich city. Also very poor parts of the city, but generally there's a big middle class in Shanghai, and they're very unhappy. I did a talk not so long ago at Fudan University, which is one of the great universities of China, and there I spoke to a lot of graduate students, and there are a lot of students who had done their basic degree in China, gone abroad for graduate studies, and were now back in China with the best jobs at their disposal, about to move into very, very high-level jobs. And they kept saying to me, 26, 27-year-old kids saying, well, I have all that and I'm still unhappy, and I don't know why that is. And that really mirrors what people say in the West. there's still something missing. Which shows that, I guess it seems such an obvious thing to say, but material wealth can't really ever provide you with that missing thing.
Yeah, that search for intimacy is definitely. I think sometimes when there's so much an excess of things, that kind of throws it back in your face even more as well.
Yeah, and so a lot of the characters in the novel are they're searching. They devote vast amounts of their time and energy into finding a partner. Which is really what a lot of people in Shanghai are doing. I mean, a lot of my friends, you have this phenomenon in Shanghai where there are large numbers of very successful, professionally successful, very highly educated women in their 30s and 40s who are still single, and all they can talk about is finding a man. It's extraordinary. There's a very sort of arbitrary cutoff point, which is 26. So after 26, after 26, the term, which is very widely used, I thought it was a joke, but it's not a joke. It's not a joke in Shanghai. Is that you become what's known as a shengnu, remainder woman. And I have friends. I was speaking to a friend who was 37, just split up with a boyfriend, and said, "Well, my only hope now is to find a Westerner, because Westerners are much more forgiving about age." And it's sort of tragic. Very. And they're all sort of always on their on their smartphones checking their new messages on QQ or MSN just in case some guy has messaged them, and it's extraordinary, because in such a short space of time, that's where people have arrived at. And I just think there's something quite weird going on there. Yeah,
and it's sort of like it harkens back to, watching episodes of Sex in the City, thinking about New York, or, the man shortages in Sydney or whatever.
Yeah, but it's quite poignant, though. I think it's more poignant in Shanghai, because it's, this isn't New York, which has had, decades of being middle class. Shanghai has really only, like the rest of China, recently come out of quite desperate poverty. So I find that the swiftness of these transformations quite poignant.
Yeah, that's very true. It's talking about change as well, quick change and people dealing with it. There's Phoebe in the books, housemate, has a lovely monologue about change, and it's kind of are you sure you've changed? Everyone says they've changed, but everyone's obsessed with it. Chinese are always talking about change, but no one has. And she's basically like, I'm bored of hearing about change. And it's kind of interesting because the characters are sort of eternally looking for change in their lives and seeking to bring it about. But I wonder, in a sort of broader sense, if we talk about change, often in a positive kind of way, but as a way of just glossing over what's actually happening. It's sort of that idea of, not progress at any cost, but progress is happening. Change, busy, and
I would agree with that. I think this whole notion of change, which is linked to the notion of success, is become something we become conditioned to thinking we must have, we must evolve, we must change, we must be successful. I'm not sure what. There was a time when just being okay or being average was perfectly acceptable, and now you can't. In every sphere, you don't have self-help books saying how to be just okay. It's you have self-help books saying how to be amazing and how to be. And I think there's when I see how kids are schooled nowadays. I mean, I spent the first 5 months of this year teaching in Singapore, and it's crazy. The schooling system in large parts of the world, particularly in Asia, has become fixated on this idea of excellence. I don't know what excellence means, and I think nor do the characters. Yan Yan, who you point out, is an interesting character. She's been someone who's been left behind by this. She hasn't, and which a lot of people are in China. There's this whole from an external point of view, people looking at China just see these glittering transformations, but they don't realise that vast numbers of people are left behind. Sorry, go on. Yeah, no, it's a brutal change.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty cutthroat. So do you think there might be at some time in the near future a bit of a deliberate opting out? Because in a way, Yin Yin kind of, she just stays put. She stays in her jammies. She stays at home, and in a way, that's her way of coping.
She sort of reverted to slightly infantile.
Yeah, there's that. But I just wonder whether you think there's any cessation inside, or people will kind of say being content, being okay is okay. Let's move back to the country.
Well, I think that I think there has to be, and I think it's already starting in very small ways. So. All over China, there's the phenomenon of the homestay holidays, people going, rich people from Beijing or Shanghai going into very traditional villages up in the hills and eating home cooked food. And there's a real nostalgia attached to the countryside. I think as there is in many Asian countries. So I think inevitably that will happen. But I think before we get to that level of sort of more balanced sensibility, I think there's going to be a lot more upheaval. Yeah,
and maybe a lot more of sort of division of class and money.
Oh, hugely. I mean, I think at the moment I think large numbers of people still feel as if they can be part of that upward curve, but the moment large numbers of them stop feeling that, then I think that's when there are going to be lots of very deep divisions.
Yeah, and I wonder about reflections or similarities between Malaysia and China. You mentioned your parents, visiting you, and because I think perhaps more in the 80s there was, and I don't know much about Malaysia at all, but there was a sense of real progress and going forward, and I just wonder whether there were some similarities. I mean, in the book there's definitely references to, just mindless construction versus heritage concerns and blah, 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 and you give lovely examples of for both countries in the book, but I'm wondering if there are other sort of similarities in terms of...
I mean, it's difficult for me to speak about the two countries in the same way because they're so fundamentally different. I mean, Malaysia is essentially quite a small country. I mean, China is huge. I mean, enormous, and has a much deeper, richer, and kind of more violent history than Malaysia's. And Malaysia, in comparison, is very calm. What is interesting is that. In terms of the construction of the novel, is that although the current action takes place, and you mentioned this earlier, it takes place entirely in Shanghai. In fact, what really drives the novel, what anchors the novel and drives it, I think, are the Malaysia sections. Vast parts of the novel are dedicated to Malaysia.
And it's where we learn the most about the characters.
Absolutely. I mean, when we see them in Shanghai, we just see the finished version. I mean, we see the today version, the polished version of them. We have to go back to Malaysia to see how they grew up, what really formed them. And I guess for me, some of my friends in Malaysia have read this and seen themselves really, identified themselves in the novel, and they really see it as a Malaysian novel, not as a China novel, which is really heartening for me because I really wanted to write this about the people of my generation, the people I grew up with, and the people I saw and observed while growing up, to see how their ambitions and aspirations have changed over the last 20 or 30 years. And China is a really useful way to measure, to gauge those ambitions, because it's as if this big mirror is being held up to those ambitions and aspirations. And of course, as you pointed out earlier, those ambitions are very different, they're very nuanced depending on what kind of background these people come from. But every one of the characters in the novel is based on someone I was quite deeply connected to as a child and as a teenager, because although I grew up in KL, both my mother and father come from families that have very deep ties to the countryside, and so I have a lot of cousins who still live there, and so for me, I see the very deep divisions in Malaysia between urban life and rural life, as reflected in the recent elections. And so someone like Phoebe or Gary or the young Walter would represent someone that I was related to, or or I spent my school holidays with when I went to stay in the countryside. Someone like Justin or Yinghui would represent people who grew up in the same suburb as I did in KL. And so it's in a funny way, I think it's sort of my love letter to the people I grew up with. An inquiry about where we've got to in our journeys, because we're still, we're not yet, old, so gently slipping into middle age, but there's a sense in which the voyage isn't quite over, and that's why some people have said, why don't we get any final answers at the end of the book? Why do we not know what happens exactly? Because I think there's, as a part of, first of all, as a reader, I quite like books that give you the impression that the characters live on after the novel, that they have a life after the novel, and they stay with you after the novel's finished. But secondly, I think that we can never really see characters in their totality. We can only see them in this stage of their lives. And I think there is a sort of a closure to this stage of their life. They've reached a certain understanding. They've undergone quite a sort of a harrowing journey, emotional journey that's lasted basically a year for most of them. And they've come out at the end of that at slightly different places. We get a sense of where they are, and I think we also get a sense of where they might go from here based on what we've seen them do in the last year. So I think I like that sense of exploring where I'm going as a writer, and as a person, and where these characters are going as well.
Yeah, no, I think when things are all tied up with nice bows on them, it sort of extinguishes the characters in a way.
Well, it's also if storytelling is going to be true to life, then life isn't like. Life isn't neat. It's not. It doesn't have nice closure.
That's right. I wonder if you would give us a little taste from the book. Just
How much
a quick
time do I have?
Maybe the quick reading you were talking about. We talked about different versions, but
I might, if I take 5 minutes.
Absolutely
actually,
fine.
I might. I can introduce you the character of Phoebe.
Great.
She was not from any part of China, but from a country thousands of miles to the south, and in that country she had grown up in a small town in the far northeast. It is a region that is poor and remote, so she is used to people thinking of her as inferior, even in her own country. In her small town, the way of life had not changed very much for 50 years, and would probably never change. Visitors from the capital city used to call it charming, but they didn't have to live there. It was not a place for dreams and ambitions, so Phoebe did not dream. She did what all the other young boys and girls did when they left school at 16. They travelled across the mountain range that cut the country in two to find work on the west coast, moving slowly southward until they reached the capital. Here are some of the jobs her friends took in the year they left home. Trainee waiter, assistant fate watch stallholder, karaoke hostess, assembly line worker in a semiconductor factory, bar girl, shampoo girl, water cooler delivery man, seafood restaurant cleaner. Phoebe's job was amongst those listed above, but she'd rather not say which one. 5 years in these kinds of jobs. They passed so quickly. Then she had some luck. There'd been a girl who disappeared. Everyone thought she was in trouble. She'd been hanging out with a gangster, the kind of big city boy you couldn't tell your small town parents about. And everyone thought it wouldn't be long before she was into drugs or prostitution. They were sure of it because she turned up one day with a big jade bracelet and a black eye. But from nowhere, Phoebe received an email from this girl. She wasn't in trouble, she was in China. She just decided that enough was enough and left one morning without telling her boyfriend. She'd saved enough money to go to Hong Kong, where she'd been a karaoke hostess for a while. She's not ashamed to say she'd done it. She did it, because everyone does it, but it was not for long. And now she was working in Shenzhen. She was a restaurant manager, a classy international place, in charge of a staff of 16. Thing is, she'd met a businessman from Beijing who was going to marry her and take her up north, and she wanted to make sure that everything was okay at the restaurant before she left. They always needed good waiting staff at New World Restaurant. Just come, don't worry about visas, we can fix that. There were 2 smiley faces and a winky one at the end of the email. Those days were so exciting when they emailed each other several times a day. What clothes shall I bring? What is the winter weather like? What kind of shoes do I need for my uniform? Each email that arrived from China made Phoebe feel that she was one step closer to lifting herself up in the world and becoming someone successful. It made the hair salon where she was working at the time seem so small. When the client said to her, "Hey Phoebe, you're not concentrating," she just laughed inside because she knew that very soon she would be the one giving them orders and leaving them tips. It took her a few weeks to get enough money together for the ticket to Hong Kong plus a bit extra to get her to Shenzhen. She didn't need all that much money. She would start making plenty once she got there, her friend assured her. From then on, anything was possible. She could start her own business doing whatever she wanted. Some former waitresses at the restaurant were already going around in chauffeur-driven cars just a year after they quit their jobs. New China was amazing. She would see for herself. No one asks too many questions. No one cares where you're from. All that counts is your ability. If you can do a job, you're hired. People say that it's hard to leave their lives behind, and that when the time comes for you to do so, you will feel reluctance and longing for your home. But these are people with nice lives to leave behind. For others, it's different. Leaving is a relief. The emails continued, full of exclamation marks as usual, but they were less frequent. And finally, at the internet cafe near East Tsim Sha Tsui station, waiting for the train to Shenzhen, Phoebe logged on for the first time in 4 days to find not a single email from her friend. Not even a short message, followed by lots of smileys. When at last she got to Shenzhen, it took her some time to locate the restaurant. The sign was proud and shiny. New World International Restaurant, it read above twin pillars of twisted gold dragons. Phoebe recognized it from the photos her friend had sent her. The menu was in a glass case outside, a sure sign of a classy joint. But as she approached, Phoebe's heart began to experience a dark fluttering in her ribcage, the way she imagined bat wings would feel against her cheek. It was a sensation that would stay with her for the rest of her time in China. The glass doors were open, but the restaurant inside was dim, even though it was in the middle of the afternoon. When she stepped inside, she saw an empty space without any chairs and tables. Part of the floor had been ripped up, and on the bare concrete she could see messy patches of glue where carpets had once been laid. There was a bar decorated with scenes of Chinese legends carved in bronze, cranes flying over mountains and lakes. Some workmen were shifting machinery and tools at the end of the restaurant, and when Phoebe called out to them, they seemed confused. The restaurant had closed a few days ago. Soon it would be a hot pot chain. The people who worked there, no idea, probably just got a job somewhere else. No one stays in a job for long in Shenzhen anyway. She tried calling her friend's mobile phone number, but it was dead. "This number is out of use," the voice told her over and over again. Each time she dialed, it was the same. "This number is out of use."
It's very, it's very emblematic of all the stories in the book. This tantalising hope and, you know, that idea that, yeah, if you work hard enough, you'll get there. And Phoebe is a great case in point. She works hard and she does succeed for a little while there, but then things...
So what happens thereafter is, I mean, without spoiling it too much, is that she's then forced into a sort of slightly covert life where she can't, like a lot of immigrants who find themselves on hard times, you're faced with a choice. You either go back and admit, you know, shame, not to necessarily to other people, but to yourself. I mean, it's sort of a failure. You have to admit that, you know, your great adventure was in fact a failure. And, you know, she spent a lot of time saying to people that, you know, she's going to go to China. When she comes back, she'll be rich. And you see this, you know, all the time. And in London, the store, there's a kind of a, you know, grocery store, late night grocery store owned by a Moroccan guy, and it's a really rundown shop. I mean, you know, it's kind of quite manky. And once a year he hires a Mercedes to drive all the way back to Morocco, and it's purely to show people that, you know, his life in in England has been a success. And so Phoebe's faced with that choice. She takes a very bold, some might say foolhardy choice to stay in China, and is therefore forced into a sort of slightly covert life of someone who's always living on the edge of legality, legitimacy, and in the end, blags her way from one job into another, and does some dodgy things in order to stay in China, and then moves to Shanghai.
Yeah, and I think it's actually mentioned a few times in the book. There's that sense that her sort of, without wanting to give anything away, but her fake persona, it becomes her. She becomes.
Yeah, there's
Phoebe.
Always exactly. There's always a sort of a time when that persona that people like Phoebe construct for themselves comes crashing in on their reality, and they're not sure what to do. And the problem for her is that as she moves through her life in her new glittering life in Shanghai, she comes into contact with the other characters, sometimes in a very positive way. So she meets Ying Hui and gets a great new job that changes her fortunes and allows her to sort of start to become the person she really wants to become. She manages a spa, which is sort of a totally perfect job for her. But her internet dating eventually brings her into contact with Walter, who himself is also pretending to be someone he's not. And so they're in this terrible situation where they both have established an emotional bond, a rapport, but because they're both pretending to be someone they're not, they can't. They're faced with a big choice. Do they reveal who they are and risk losing everything, or do they go along with this charade and risk not getting the intimacy?
Yeah, and you'll have to read it to find out. Just one more question before we throw to the audience, and it kind of links in with that, is that about, we've got these 5 characters, they come into contact with each other, some, through varying kind of connections and threads. The structure of telling their stories is very interesting because they're taking alternating chapters, and so you get varying perspectives, and sometimes you see the same event from 2 different characters' perspectives, and sometimes at quite different removed points of the book, which makes you question their version of themselves. But it also made me think about historical narratives and the way that history, can be written in very different ways, and made me think how we'll look back on this, point in history in China and the new China, and how it will be written. Yeah,
and also how different people perceive time differently. Yeah. So for someone like Justin, who's had, he's basically had a breakdown. To him, time is just it just stretches out before him, and he just can't. He doesn't know how to fill it. I mean, he's sort of had a breakdown, and it basically suffering from depression, and just doesn't leave his apartment. So for him, he just has endless amounts of time on his hands to reflect on what's gone on in his past. So a lot of his sections are really not about New Shanghai. They're about the circumstances of his growing up. And of course, he's had a long-standing crush on Ying Hui, and for her, life is about this forward. That she experiences time in a very different way, because she really doesn't want to look back. She wants to look forward, constantly looking forward, to escape what's gone on in her past. So for her, through her, we feel the energy of New China, as we do through Phoebe. The women in the novel, it seems to me, this wasn't a deliberate thing at all. They're much more proactive with the way they engage with China.
Yeah, and propelling themselves and trying to create that future, very aware that they're creating a future for themselves, which is kind of interesting. Brings us back to that whole, you've got these kind of pseudo-feminist women, or now in China and in the big cities, but yet still looking for the man.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, it's kind of where they both fall down a bit as well, these characters, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's so much. There's such a sharp contrast between this idea that you can be the master of your destiny, on the one hand, but on the other hand, everyone is still incredibly vulnerable, emotionally vulnerable, and it's a vulnerability that is magnified by the experience of living in a megacity like Shanghai.
Absolutely. Yeah. it's hard to kind of keep it all at
I mean,
bay,
just my 2 days in Melbourne have totally kind of. I totally understand why Melbourne's like always in one of the top 10 most livable cities in the world. I mean, because there is an intimacy in Melbourne that doesn't. Although it's a big city, there's a lot of human scale, which you don't get in Shanghai. I mean, you get a lot of excitement. You get there are endless things to do in Shanghai, and an endless feeling of possibility. But you don't get the very human scale you get in Melbourne. The possibility doesn't include the possibility of intimacy. I don't think in Shanghai.
Yeah. Perhaps personal.
Well, obviously, it does happen, but I personally didn't feel it.
All right, we better throw to questions. There are roving mics, so does anyone have a question about China, Malaysia, the book? Maybe Tash's previous books as well. There's one gentleman there, and then there's a woman in the front. Yeah.
Hi, Tash. That was extremely interesting. We see films coming out of China all about people from the rural parts of China going to the cities, and yours is really going from the rural part of Malaysia to a city. Is there any? Do you think there'd be much difference in the experiences they would have? That's basically it.
I think they would be similar in that I think there's always a very big divide between rural life and urban life anywhere in the world. But I think the Malaysians have a stronger sense of being an outsider in Shanghai than someone, say, from Sichuan province. Although, I have a lot of friends in Shanghai who have come from other provinces in China, a lot of more rural provinces, and they feel as if they're never going to be able to feel part of the big Shanghai project, as it were, the big social transformations, and that they'll always somehow be seen as outsiders. I think that necessarily when you come from a totally different country, you will feel one step even further removed than someone who's come from another region within that country. But I think that. I think rural China is a very different place from. And I can't. When people ask me about China, I'm always very hesitant to give a global view of China, because my experience of China is really gleaned from my experiences in the big coastal cities in the east. I don't really know anything about the rural communities, and I think that life is very different. And much harder. I think that they haven't really. There's a sense in which rural China hasn't benefited as much from China's development as the cities have.
There's a woman down the front. Just wait for the mic.
There's one in front, just behind you.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for that, Tash. I was just wondering. First of all, what propelled you to want to go back to China? What was the motivation? Because I come from Singapore, and I have my own motivations and I've lived in China for a while. That's number one. Number two, I think that what you were saying about the rural-urban divide in China and in Malaysia, I can see that. As you say, all over the world there's this huge divide between rural and urban life. But I somehow get the feeling that in Malaysia, although rural Kelantan is a rural, relatively poor province, it's still the ability to get out of Kelantan into the big city KL or wherever, Penang or whatever, is much greater than, say, someone from rural China trying to get into Beijing, Shanghai or Guangzhou or whatever. For a start, in the past at least there was that whole residency thing. You couldn't even live if you didn't have a permit to live in the city. So it only really attracted very, very transient kind of rural populations. And just another thing is about whether what you have written, I haven't read the book, I must say, but whether what you have written about the Malaysian characters who've gone to, reinvent themselves in China, is that based on anybody you know, or is it just from your observations, and also whether you've actually had a chance while you were in China to really make that intimacy that you were talking about, whether you did actually get into real intimate relationships with the Chinese, people.
Okay, 3 questions in one again.
She's just roasting me.
Yeah, no. First question: why did I want to go? I mean, but as I said, earlier, it's partly out of the desire to see for myself why Malaysians were going to China. I mean, I kept hearing of people, friends of mine, relatives who had moved to China. So I wanted to go just to see myself. And once there, of course, then I was sort of fascinated by everything I saw and how complex the change was that is occurring in China. And that kept me there for a while. Second question was about the difficulty of someone moving from rural China to urban China. I think then obviously it's still difficult, and probably I think you're right, more difficult than in Malaysia, because of a lot of the administrative things. However, China, when one gets to China, one realizes that China actually functions on so many different levels. There's the official level, but also if it's a question of sorting out a permit or a piece of paper, there are ways you can do it. And also, one mustn't forget that the south, Guangdong province, the factory of China, the whole, all those big cities like outside of Guangzhou, like Dongguan, and all those cities that litter the coast down there, they're all fuel, that boom. I mean, probably half of what we're wearing tonight has been made down in that province, and those factories have been fueled by people coming from the countryside, and that is actually a really interesting phenomenon, because they are the elite of the factory world in China are young women in their 20s. So between 19 and 29 those are the powerhouses. And the interesting thing is that they're the ones who they're allowed to leave their rural communities because they're less valued than the boys. So the boys are the ones who physically work in the fields. The women are allowed to, parents say, girls, you can do whatever you want to do. So they go off to these factories, establish careers for themselves, and very quickly, in the space of 2 years, 1, 2, 3 years, become the principal breadwinner of the family. They earn so much money. I mean, it's all relative, so much more money than the rest of the family put together, that they become the de facto heads of the family. They decide what the family does. They decide whether to marry or not, which was not a choice that was open to them 20 years ago. They decide, because they're the ones buying the refrigerators, the color TVs, the motorbikes for the feckless brother at home, and all those kind of things. And because quite often if you're a registered rural household, if the firstborn is a girl, then you're allowed another child. So you have this sort of big shift in
rural communities,
kind of culture, which is incredibly interesting and very empowering in some ways.
Well, and that's going to be an interesting story to chart as well, because though you're taking all the young women out, not many of them are going to be going back.
When they do go back, I mean, they've lived these lives in big cities. I mean, they're pretty grim cities, but they're cities, and then they have to go back, and their marriage choices are basically all the boys who've never left the village. So it's a tough thing. And finally, the majority of my friends. Oh no, there was a fourth question buried in there somewhere, actually, which was that reinvention. Yes, I mean, I saw reinvention. Part of the reason I wanted to write a novel based on characters who are really reinventing themselves was that I saw that happening every day, more or less. All these expats I met in Shanghai, not just Asian expats, but Western expats, were somehow, they had these incredible sort of, personas, and you just knew that a lot of it was you know, if not a straightforward fabrication, there's certainly an exaggeration. And there's a sense in which, you know, because China's moving so fast, they were able to do that. You know, if you go to Shanghai to set up a company, if you can provide a service, China has so much hunger for that service, for that labor, that no one really stops to ask you any questions. If you can provide it, you provide it. Whereas in the West, the first thing that people ask you is, okay, show me the qualifications, show me your degrees, your diplomas, all the you know, the forms, the paperwork. That doesn't happen in China. Finally, was I able to establish intimacy? Well, I mean, the majority of my friends in Shanghai are local Shanghainese, so I have very close friends in Shanghai. But I think, you know, when you're talking about an intimate relation, I mean, you're really talking about in the case of the characters in the novel, they're talking about partners, and that's a whole different ballgame altogether. I think it's really difficult.
Oh yeah. I think we've got time for one very quick question, if anyone else, just in the front here.
It's just a really sort of basic question. I love your last two books, yeah, especially Map of the Invisible Heart in particular. But I was just wondering who your readership was in general. So, you know, sort of, if it was more Malaysian, more sort of English.
I don't really have a specific. I don't write with a specific readership in mind. I write. I guess I write for an imaginary reader who somehow, you know, with whom I have a very close relationship, and I don't. I mean, that reader is not gender specific, it's not age specific, it's not culture specific. Certainly, that was the case for the first two books, which is why there's a lot. My books tend to have a lot of. They don't have a lot of explanation of cultural objects, cultural phenomena. They take a lot for granted. For this book, I would have to say, I guess I wrote more with a Malaysian audience in mind, because it seemed, or not so much even a Malaysian audience. I take that back. I wrote it for a much more specific group of people, which were the group of people who I thought. Sorry?
Your mates.
Yeah, basically the people, family. You know, it's a very personal. I think it's probably in that way my most personal novel. And I had it took a long time, and in the writing, this was the first novel really that I wrote without having to do any other work on the side. I mean, I didn't do any teaching, I didn't do any journalism. I really worked very hard on this novel every day pretty much every day for 4 years, and it still took me 4 years. And part of the reason for that length of time was because I wanted to kind of savor the experience of writing for a very small group of people, and I had no idea whether the book would be comprehensible to anyone who didn't grow up in that environment. And that's quite exciting as a writer when you think you're taking risks. And ultimately, when I finished the novel and I gave it to my readers, none of whom my close readers, actually only one of whom is Malaysian, which is my sister. I was so relieved that they all responded well to it and got it, and ever since I think the reception's been quite good, even amongst people who have never been to Malaysia. So I think that's quite heartening, which I think to me shows that one can be universal by being very specific, and I think the Malaysia passages are really, really specific to a couple of neighbourhoods. Even the KL ones are very they do go into quite great detail. And a lot of my Malaysian friends were amazed that those passages were allowed to stand by my editors who are in London. But I didn't think that was an issue.
No, and it obviously gives the book so much more reality. Or not that we can really know that it's reality, but yeah, just that level of detail and I guess honesty.
I think for me, all the books I love reading are the ones that take you to a very specific place, but in a way and take you to a very specific group of people, but in a way that allows you to relate their lives to your own and to see yourself reflected in them. So I really hope I've done this
You have, I think,
novel.
Geographically specific, but sort of emotionally universal or something. Yeah. Good question, thank you. I'm going to reserve the right to ask one more question, even though we're nearly up to time, and that is whether you know what happened to your mother's shampoo girl who went to... No, I wonder.
No.
Anyway,
she was called Mei Li, which is...
Yeah, I'm sure you'd be able to track it. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming.
And books at the back.